A king's fate once hung on the trembling words of a woman in a trance. The Pythia of Delphi, seated in her sacred chamber, could with one cryptic phrase launch 1,000 warships or send a proud ruler into exile. Her voice, they believed, was the voice of a god. But what if that voice was not entirely divine? This video pulls back the curtain on the oracle makers, the ancient prophets, and the powerful patrons who shaped their every word. We will journey into the secret lives of these figures, uncovering the hidden training, the political machinations, and the vast sums of money that turned spiritual guidance into a tool of empire. By the end, you will see these oracles not as passive mystics, but as brilliant performers in a high-stakes game of power, a revelation that completely rewrites our understanding of the ancient world. How did a young girl from a small village become the most influential voice in the Mediterranean? What did kings and merchants truly purchase when they bought a prophecy? The answers lie in the shadows, where faith and ambition colluded to shape history. What do you believe is the real source of prophetic power? The popular image of a prophet is a lone mystic, a solitary figure receiving visions in the wilderness. But the reality of the oracle maker was far more complex and infinitely more powerful. They were not merely passive vessels waiting for a divine whisper. They were active architects of fate. Think of them as the chief executives of a sacred corporation, their office a specific, hallowed location like the rustling oak grove of Dodona or the remote oasis of Siwa. Their role demanded a unique fusion of skills, a blend of priest, stage performer, political advisor, and master of human psychology. They were the original spin doctors, interpreting the raw, chaotic signs of the gods into polished, actionable advice for kings and commoners alike. So how did one become such a figure? The selection process was itself a sacred mystery. A young person might be chosen for their unusual sensitivity. Perhaps a strange dream or an uncanny event in their childhood marked them as touched by the divine. In some traditions, they came from specific families, a sacred lineage that carried the privilege and burden of this office. Their initial training was intense and secretive, a long immersion in the rituals, chants, and lore of their sanctuary. They learned to recognize the subtle signs in nature, from the flight patterns of birds to the specific rustle of leaves, and more importantly, they learned the art of crafting a message. A raw omen was just noise. It was the oracle maker who gave it meaning, structure, and power. This foundational role, built on ritual and recognition, was the first step in building an institution that could sway empires. King Croesus of Lydia once tested the oracles of the ancient world with a brilliant, if desperate, experiment. He sent messengers to the 7 most famous prophetic centers, instructing them to ask on the 100th day after their departure what the king was doing at that very moment back home. The messengers from Delphi returned with the correct answer, describing in vivid detail how Croesus was boiling a lamb and a tortoise together in a bronze cauldron. This was not a simple test of divine knowledge. It was a king shopping for the most effective political weapon he could find. He was not seeking spiritual comfort, he was vetting a service provider. His subsequent lavish gifts to the Oracle of Delphi, including a fortune in pure gold, were not offerings of faith. They were a down payment on a prophecy that would justify his coming war against the Persian Empire. This relationship between ambitious rulers and oracular sanctuaries formed the very foundation of the prophetic industry. Kings, pharaohs, and powerful city-states were the primary patrons, the venture capitalists of the ancient divine. Their sponsorship took tangible forms, vast estates gifted to the temple, a permanent stream of treasure filling its coffers, and the unwavering protection of state armies. In return, they expected a tangible service. A favorable prophecy could legitimize a questionable claim to the throne, transforming a usurper into a God-appointed ruler. It could demonize an enemy and sanctify a military campaign, turning an act of aggression into a holy war. The oracle was a public relations firm with the highest authority imaginable, the gods themselves. We have surviving treaties and official decrees that show this was not a hidden arrangement. City-states would pass laws directly funding the upkeep of oracles, and in times of crisis, they would send official state delegations, known as theroi, to seek guidance. The symbiotic relationship between the throne and the temple was the bedrock upon which the entire system was built. Without the state's gold and its political might, the great oracles would have been mere local curiosities. But with that support, their words could echo across continents, shaping the destinies of nations. This deep entanglement with power, however, came with its own set of vulnerabilities and whispered compromises. While kings sought prophecies to conquer lands, merchants used them to conquer markets. A wealthy trader from Corinth, contemplating a perilous voyage across the sea, would not set sail without first consulting an oracle. For him, a favorable prophecy was not just a spiritual comfort, it was a business necessity, a divine endorsement he could present to his investors and partners to secure the vast sums required for his enterprise. This was the second great pillar of support for the oracle makers, the immense economic influence of the merchant class. Commerce and prophecy were deeply intertwined, creating a feedback loop of wealth and divine favor. Merchant guilds and individual magnates became generous patrons, funding the construction of new temple buildings, porticos, and treasuries at oracular sites. In return, they sought what any modern business would crave: insider information. They asked the gods about the safety of proposed trade routes, the future prices of commodities like grain and olive oil, and the overall stability of the economies they depended on. The archaeological record is filled with their gratitude. At sites like Delphi, archaeologists have unearthed countless dedications, small statues, and inscribed plaques offered by merchant groups. These are not vague prayers, they are specific thank you notes to the gods for a successful voyage to Egypt, for a profitable sale of pottery, or for the timely arrival of a grain shipment that averted a financial disaster. This was a brilliant system. The merchants provided the oracles with a constant stream of wealth, far more reliable than the occasional grand gift from a king. In return, the oracles provided a perceived direct line to divine favor, a psychological edge in a world of immense risk. A positive prophecy could calm a nervous market, attract new capital to a venture, or legitimize a trade monopoly. It blurred the lines between piety and profit, transforming the temple from a purely spiritual center into a kind of ancient business bureau and divine insurance agency. The gods, it seemed, were not just masters of fate, but also silent partners in vast commercial empires. With both royal and merchant patronage fueling their operations, the great oracles became institutions of staggering wealth and influence. Yet this very success created a new set of challenges, a silent pressure to deliver the answers their powerful patrons wanted to hear. The path to Delphi was a pilgrimage of deliberate disorientation. A visitor would leave the familiar coastal plains and begin a grueling ascent up the slopes of Mount Parnassus. The air grew thinner, the landscape more severe with every step. Finally, they would arrive at a sanctuary wedged between towering cliffs, where a strange, sweet smell occasionally drifted from a fissure in the rock. This was not a random holy place. It was a meticulously staged theater of the divine. Every oracle site, from the whispering oak grove of Dodona to the secluded oasis of Siwa, was chosen for its power to overwhelm the senses and humble the seeker. The journey itself was a form of psychological preparation, stripping away a person's worldly confidence and making them receptive to the profound experience they believed was coming. The natural world was the first actor in this sacred drama. At Delphi, it was the chasm emitting those faint, intoxicating vapors. At Dodona, it was the sound of the wind through the leaves of ancient oak trees, interpreted as the voice of Zeus. At Siwa, it was the sheer, isolating power of the desert, a vast emptiness that made the oasis spring seem like a miracle. These were not mere backdrops. They were the raw materials of prophecy, the phenomena that the oracle makers learned to interpret and perform alongside. The very remoteness of these locations was a strategic choice. A difficult journey ensured that only the truly committed or the immensely powerful could seek an audience. It filtered out the casual and amplified the value of the final revelation. Human hands then enhanced this natural power with breathtaking architecture. Upon entering the sanctuary at Delphi, a pilgrim would walk the sacred way, a winding path flanked by stunning treasuries. These were not mere storehouses. They were lavish, miniature temples built by rival city-states like Athens and Sparta, each one a blatant display of wealth and devotion, a permanent reminder of who held favor and influence at the oracle. This was divine politics carved in stone. The path led inevitably to the great temple of Apollo, the heart of the operation. Inside was the most controlled space of all, the Aditon. This was the inner sanctum, a small, enclosed chamber where the Pythia would deliver her prophecies. Very few were ever permitted inside. This architectural funnel, from the overwhelming approach to the exclusive inner chamber, was a masterclass in narrative control. It built anticipation, enforced hierarchy, and concentrated all authority onto the single figure of the prophet. The sacred site was far more than a location. It was a carefully engineered device designed to convince every visitor, from a common farmer to an emperor, that they were in the direct, undeniable presence of the gods. Her previous life ended the moment the priests pointed in her direction. The young woman chosen to be the Pythia at Delphi was not selected for her intellect or her ambition. The criteria were starkly different. She was often a local peasant girl chosen for her perceived purity, her simple background, and sometimes a specific familial line that was deemed sacred to the god Apollo. Her entire identity, her name, her family connections were systematically stripped away. From that day forward, she was no longer a person, she was a vessel, a role that demanded the complete erasure of the individual who filled it. This was the ultimate sacrifice that underpinned the entire prophetic industry, the human cost of becoming the voice of the gods. The selection process itself was a sacred mystery, designed to find a candidate with the right physical and psychological makeup. Different oracular centers had their own unique requirements. At the Oracle of Dodona, the prophetesses were often elderly women, chosen for their lifelong devotion and wisdom. In other traditions, a candidate might demonstrate a natural susceptibility to trance states, perhaps through vivid dreams or episodes that were interpreted as divine possession. Physical attributes mattered too, a particular birthmark, a certain symmetry of features, or even an unusual sensitivity to environmental stimuli like the intoxicating vapors at Delphi could mark someone as chosen. It was a search for a specific type of human instrument, one that could be finely tuned to the rituals of the sanctuary. Once chosen, the real work began. The training was an intense and secretive immersion, a complete reprogramming of a human being. The new oracle had to memorize a vast library of knowledge. She learned the complex, precise rituals that preceded a prophetic session, every chant, every libation, every sacrifice. She studied the long and illustrious history of her site, the stories of past prophecies and the powerful patrons who had sought them. Most crucially, she was schooled in the delicate art of the pronouncement itself. She learned to craft responses that were authoritative yet ambiguous, phrases that could be interpreted in multiple ways depending on the outcome. A raw omen was useless. It was the oracle maker's trained interpretation that gave it power and, more importantly, political survivability. She was not just learning to speak for a god, she was learning to navigate the treacherous waters of human expectation and imperial demand. This rigorous transformation from a simple village girl to the Pythia was the hidden foundation of the entire operation. The trembling voice that kings feared was not merely divine, it was meticulously trained. Her days began not with prayer, but with a brutal regimen of sensory deprivation and physical exhaustion. Before the Pythia could even approach the sacred chasm, she had to be stripped of her own humanity. She would fast for 3 full days, consuming only water and perhaps a few sacred herbs, her body growing light and her mind increasingly susceptible. Then came the icy plunge into the waters of the Castalian spring, a shocking baptism meant to wash away all worldly contamination. This was not a gentle cleansing, it was a physical shock to the system, a deliberate induction of a trance-like state before she ever set foot in the temple. The final step was the chewing of laurel leaves, not for nourishment but for their mild toxic properties. The leaves released chemicals that induced a tingling numbness in the mouth and a light-headed dizziness, further blurring the lines between the physical and the divine. This entire sequence was a performative technology, a carefully engineered process to create the perfect human instrument for the god's voice. Every gesture was codified and unchangeable. The sacrifice of a goat had to be performed with exacting precision. The animal was doused with cold water, and if it shivered from head to tail, the sign was favorable and the session could proceed. If it did not, the entire day's consultations were cancelled. This was not left to chance, it was a controlled variable, a piece of theater that demonstrated the god's willingness to communicate. Inside the temple, the burning of barley meal and laurel on a sacred hearth filled the adyton with a thick, fragrant smoke, obscuring the Pythia's form and disorienting anyone present. The predictability of these rituals was their genius. A visiting Spartan general and an Athenian merchant would undergo the exact same preparatory spectacle. They witnessed the same fasting, the same bathing, the same precise sacrifice. This rigid consistency made the eventual prophecy feel more authentic. The oracle's trance and her cryptic words emerged from a framework of absolute, unchanging order. The ritual created a container of certainty, so that the unpredictable message within it could be accepted as genuinely divine. This mastery of rites was the first and most fundamental lesson for any oracle in training. It taught them that their power did not spring from within, but from their flawless execution of an ancient external script. But what happened when the ritual was complete and the human vessel was finally prepared to speak? The trembling voice of the Pythia did not simply deliver a message, it wove a linguistic labyrinth. Her pronouncements were masterpieces of ambiguity, designed not to reveal a single truth, but to encompass all possible outcomes. The most famous example remains the prophecy given to King Croesus, a man who believed he was being promised certain victory. If you cross the river Hollies, you will destroy a great empire, the oracle declared. Croesus heard only what he wanted to hear, leading his army to a catastrophic defeat. The great empire destroyed was, of course, his own. This was not a failed prophecy. It was a perfectly executed one. The empire in question was never named, and the verb destroy held a beautifully double-edged meaning. It could mean to ruin an enemy or to bring about one's own ruin. The statement was a flawless, self-fulfilling trap of language. This level of sophistication was not a divine accident. It was the core of an oracle's professional training. The second, and perhaps most crucial, regimen was the mastery of ambiguous language. Apprentices spent years learning to construct these verbal shields. They studied the structures that made a prophecy both powerful and unassailable. The classic Delphic pronouncement relied on several key techniques. One was the use of dual meanings, where a single word could be interpreted in two completely different ways. Another was the conditional clause, a statement that hinged on an if, creating a possibility rather than a certainty. And a third was the riddle-like formulation, a poetic puzzle that forced the seeker to project their own hopes and fears onto the message. Imagine a merchant asking if his ship would return safely laden with goods. A poorly trained oracle might give a simple yes or no, a gamble that could destroy the sanctuary's credibility if a storm sank the vessel. A master oracle maker, however, would craft a response like "The wooden bird flies true if the eastern wind holds its breath." The wooden bird is the ship, the eastern wind a common metaphor for storms. The entire prophecy is conditional. It sounds deeply poetic and specific, yet it commits to nothing. If the ship returns, the prophecy was clearly correct. If it sinks, the eastern wind did not hold its breath. The oracle remains infallible. This was far more than clever wordplay. It was an essential survival mechanism. In a world where a single, failed prediction could lead a humiliated king to send his soldiers to burn the temple to the ground, ambiguous language was the oracle's primary defense. It protected the institution's reputation from the unpredictable chaos of real-world events. More subtly, it served the psychological needs of the patrons themselves. A general already determined to go to war would hear only the confirmation of victory in a vague prophecy. His anxious rival, seeking a reason to avoid conflict, might hear a dire warning in the very same words. The oracle's genius was in giving people permission to believe what they already wanted to believe, all while cloaking that permission in the unquestionable authority of the divine. The ability to speak in riddles was therefore not a mark of deception, but a carefully honed and indispensable professional skill, the sharpest tool in the oracle maker's kit. But wielding this tool required more than just linguistic cleverness. It demanded a deep and intimate understanding of the very people who sought their counsel. The Pythia's training extended far beyond ritual and riddles into a third, more worldly discipline. She was, in effect, the ancient world's most sophisticated intelligence analyst. Think of the stream of supplicants climbing the sacred way, an Athenian admiral desperate for a sign before engaging the Persian fleet, a Spartan elder inquiring about a looming border dispute, a merchant from Corinth whispering questions about trade routes and rival ports. Each visitor before their audience would be carefully interviewed by the temple priests. These conversations were not casual. They were debriefings, a systematic collection of data on the fears, ambitions, and political pressures facing every corner of the Mediterranean. Over years, the oracle and her priests amassed an unparalleled database of geopolitical knowledge. They knew which kingdoms were on the brink of war, which alliances were fraying, and which rulers were secretly building their armies. This was not divine foresight, it was human intelligence gathering on a grand scale. This deep, ongoing education in current events and international relations was the final, crucial layer of an oracle's training. She learned the intricate histories and long-standing rivalries of the city-states that sought her counsel. She understood that a question from Thebes was never just a question. It was a move in a centuries-old struggle with Athens. This knowledge gave her ambiguous pronouncements their terrifying power. When a general asked if he should march against a neighboring kingdom, the Pythia's response could be framed to subtly favor the side the oracle's intelligence suggested was stronger or more likely to win. Her words, while still a riddle, would nudge the seeker toward the outcome the sanctuary's vast information network had already deemed probable. The prophecy, "The wooden horse will only enter the gates if the old lion sleeps," might sound like pure mysticism. But to the trained oracle, the wooden horse was a known siege engine being built by one city, and the old lion was the aging, ailing king of their enemy. The statement was a masterpiece of informed guidance, validating a specific course of action based on secret, real-world knowledge. This system transformed the oracle from a passive channel into an active participant in world affairs. Her divine insight was the product of exceptional awareness, a hidden network of information that allowed her to see the threads of the future because she so thoroughly understood the tangled web of the present. With her training complete, the oracle was a formidable instrument of power. But how did this entire system, this intricate dance of ritual, language, and intelligence, finally collapse under the weight of its own success? The moment of truth was a carefully orchestrated performance. Inside the dark, smoke-filled Aditon, the Pythia took her seat on the tall, three-legged cauldron, the tripod that positioned her directly over the rocky chasm. Her body, already weakened by days of fasting and the shock of the ritual bath, would begin to tremble. Her breathing grew rapid as she inhaled the faint, sweet-smelling vapors rising from the earth. Her eyes might roll back, her limbs convulse in a controlled, rhythmic shudder. Then from her lips came sounds, not the clear, poetic verses we read in history books, but guttural cries, fragmented words, and ecstatic moans. This was not a sign of a failed connection to the divine. It was the peak of the sacred performance. The raw, unsettling sounds were the proof that the god had truly taken possession of his human vessel. The spectacle was designed to be overwhelming, to convince every sense of the supplicant that they were witnessing something beyond human comprehension. This altered state was not left entirely to chance. Modern geological studies of the site have found evidence of ethylene, a sweet-smelling gas that can induce trance-like states, mild euphoria, and physical tremors. The ancient priests may not have known the chemistry, but they understood the effect. They had perfected the conditions to trigger a profound physiological and psychological shift in the Pythia, using the very geology of the mountain as a prop in their divine theater. Her convulsions and distorted voice were not a loss of control, but the ultimate demonstration of it, the final, crucial step in the manufacturing of a prophecy. But the raw, chaotic sounds she produced were only half the show. Standing beside her in the smoky chamber were the temple priests, the essential supporting cast in this sacred drama. Their role was to translate the Pythia's ecstatic utterings into the polished, formal hexameter verse that would be delivered to the waiting king or merchant. This translation was the final filter, the point where the raw, divine message was shaped into the ambiguous, politically viable pronouncement the sanctuary was famous for. The priests were the editors, ensuring the final product maintained the oracle's reputation for infallible, if puzzling, wisdom. The entire event, from the trembling body to the final translated verse, was a piece of high-stakes spiritual theater. The setting, the supporting cast, and the rigid format were all meticulously designed to create an experience so powerful that it left no room for doubt. The performance was the core product, a high-wire act where the credibility of the god and the safety of the sanctuary hung in the balance with every single word. The priests of Apollo were the true architects of Delphi's power, a sophisticated management team operating in the shadows. While the Pythia trembled in a divine trance, these men, often from elite aristocratic families, maintained absolute control over the entire prophetic process. They were the gatekeepers deciding who could approach the oracle and when. A king's embassy might be fast-tracked, while a common farmer's request could be delayed for months, a subtle signal of political priorities. Before any audience, these priests conducted careful interviews, extracting crucial context from each supplicant under the guise of ritual preparation. This was not mere ceremony, it was an intelligence-gathering operation. They learned of a city-state's internal strife, a general's secret doubts, a merchant's hidden routes. This knowledge was their most potent asset. When the Pythia, deep in her altered state, began to utter her raw, fragmented sounds, the priests were ready. Their role was to translate those guttural cries into the polished, ambiguous hexameter verse for which Delphi was famous. This translation was not a simple transcription. It was an act of interpretation and careful editing. They smoothed the rough edges, inserted the poetic double meanings, and ensured the final prophecy was both authoritative and politically safe. Think of them as the ultimate public relations firm for the gods. Their education was extensive, covering poetry, history, rhetoric, and the complex political landscape of the Greek world. This training allowed them to craft responses that sounded timeless yet were perfectly calibrated for the current moment. A prophecy was rarely just a prediction. It was a carefully considered piece of strategic communication, designed to protect the sanctuary's immense wealth and influence. The priests wielded a form of soft power that kings could only envy. By shaping the very words that launched fleets and toppled rulers, they guided the fate of nations without ever drawing a sword. The trembling Pythia provided the divine spectacle, but it was the quiet, calculating priesthood that truly steered the course of history from the sacred shadows of the temple. A general's most powerful weapon was sometimes not a sword, but a prophecy. Warfare and divine consultation were inseparable in the ancient world, with military commanders forming the third great pillar of patronage for the oracle makers. These men did not seek spiritual enlightenment, they sought a tactical advantage. A favorable prophecy could unify a fractious army, imbuing common soldiers with the unshakable belief that the gods marched with them. More crucially, it could shatter the enemy's morale, casting their resistance as an act of impiety against a divine decree. This was psychological warfare sanctioned by heaven itself, and ambitious generals paid handsomely for it. The most legendary example is Alexander the Great's grueling trek across the Egyptian desert to the Oracle of Siwa. His goal was not to ask if he would be victorious, he already knew that. He demanded the priests confirm he was the literal son of the god Zeus Ammon. The oracle, perhaps sensing the immense political force standing before it, obliged. That single pronouncement transformed Alexander from a brilliant Macedonian king into a living god in the eyes of his subjects and his soldiers, a political masterstroke that cemented his authority and justified his vast conquests. This was the ultimate military consultation, where a prophecy did not just predict an outcome, it created a new, unstoppable reality. On a more routine level, the machinery of prophecy was constantly engaged in military planning. Before the devastating Peloponnesian War, the Spartans sent envoys to Delphi. They did not ask if they should fight, but who would win. The Pythia's response was a masterpiece of martial encouragement, declaring that if they fought with all their might, victory would be theirs, and that the god himself would grant it. This was not a neutral prediction, it was a divine rallying cry, immediately broadcast to every soldier in the Spartan alliance to boost morale and resolve. For a general, purchasing such an oracle was a direct investment in victory, a way to buy the courage and conviction of 10,000 men with a single, well-placed offering to the gods. The oracle makers, in turn, understood this dynamic perfectly. Their ambiguous language was perfectly suited for the chaos of the battlefield, where any result could be interpreted as the fulfillment of a god's will. A general's patronage ensured the oracle's survival, while the oracle's blessing guaranteed the general's legacy, a deadly symbiosis between the temple and the sword. A simple prophecy could cost a farmer a goat, but for a king, the price was a kingdom's ransom. The treasuries lining the sacred way at Delphi were not just beautiful monuments, they were the physical proof of a sprawling economic machine. Each one, built by a rival city-state like Athens or Sparta, functioned as a branch of an ancient international bank, a permanent display of wealth and political loyalty that fueled the entire operation. Access to the gods was a product, and its price was carefully calibrated. The initial consultation fee itself was scaled. A wealthy merchant or state embassy paid a substantial sum in precious metal, while a common citizen might offer a simple cake or a small animal. This was only the entry ticket. The next cost was the mandatory sacrifice. A supplicant had to provide a specific animal, often a goat or a sheep, for the priests to offer on the altar. This was a brilliant system. The ritual provided the dramatic proof of the god's favor through the animal's shiver, while the meat itself then fed the vast temple staff, from the priests and translators down to the cleaners and guards, turning a spiritual requirement into a sustainable source of food and income. The real financial engine, however, was the voluntary donation. After a favorable prophecy, a grateful king would not just say thank you. He would send a tithe of his war spoils, a solid gold statue, or even dedicated the revenue from an entire captured city to the oracle's upkeep. The legendary King Croesus showered Delphi with gifts, including 117 ingots of pure gold, a silver bowl so large it held 6,000 bottles of wine, and the life-sized golden statue of his baker's daughter. This was not mere gratitude, it was a strategic investment in future favor and a very public way to humble rivals by showcasing one's own devotion and wealth. Managing this staggering influx of treasure required a sophisticated administrative class. A portion was distributed among the priesthood, making them some of the most wealthy and powerful men in Greece. Another part funded the constant maintenance and expansion of the sanctuary itself, employing architects, sculptors, and laborers for generations. The rest was stored, a divine war chest that could be loaned to city-states in times of crisis, weaving the oracle even deeper into the political and economic fabric of the ancient world. This financial power allowed the oracle to operate with immense independence, its influence secured not just by faith, but by a treasury that could rival any kingdom. The trembling voice of the Pythia was supported by an empire of gold, a reality that forces us to see these sacred sites not merely as spiritual centers, but as the corporate headquarters of their age, whose primary product was certainty itself. When the last echoes of whispered prayers faded from the temple halls, the Pythia's transformation began in reverse. The divine vessel carefully dismantled, the woman would re-emerge. She was not a recluse locked in a dark cell, but often a wife and a mother, living within the temple's protected precinct under a set of rules designed to preserve her ritual purity. Her life was a study in profound duality, a constant oscillation between the sacred and the mundane. One moment, she was the trembling voice of Apollo, her words deciding the fates of empires. The next, she might be mending a tunic or watching her children play within the sanctuary walls. This was the oracle's secret existence, a life defined by relentless pressure and carefully managed isolation. The regulations governing her behavior were exhaustive. Her diet was strictly controlled, her interactions with outsiders limited and supervised. She was forbidden from certain activities that might be considered polluting, and her movements were restricted to ensure she was always ritually prepared for a sudden summons to the Aditon. This was not just about spiritual readiness, it was a practical measure. The temple could not have its primary asset, the human conduit to the divine, compromised by a simple mistake or a moment of ordinary human frailty. Imagine the psychological weight of such a life. How does a person reconcile the immense, godlike authority they wield in one sphere with the simple, human needs and emotions they experience in another? The Pythia had to master a form of spiritual compartmentalization that would challenge any modern psychologist. She had to be able to access a state of divine ecstasy on demand, and then, hours later, set that entire experience aside to attend to the needs of her family. This constant shifting of identity from the celestial to the domestic must have been an exhausting, relentless burden. The rules of her confinement, while designed to protect her sanctity, also served to isolate her. Her social circle was limited to the temple priests and her immediate family. She could not form ordinary friendships or engage in the casual gossip of the town below. This isolation was a double-edged sword. It protected the mystery of her office, but it also denied her the simple human comforts and support systems that might have helped her bear its weight. We see glimpses of this tension in the historical record. There are accounts of Pythias who resisted their calling, or who became ill from the strain of the prophetic rituals. These were not malfunctions of the divine machinery, but the predictable human responses to an unsustainable demand. The voice that launched 1,000 ships also craved a quiet moment. The woman who channeled a god also worried for her child's fever. This hidden life, with all its rules and private struggles, forces us to see these figures not as remote icons, but as profoundly human individuals. They carried the world's hopes on their shoulders while navigating their own quiet fears, a testament to the extraordinary cost of being the designated voice of the divine. For a community stripped of its home, a prophecy was more than guidance. It was the blueprint for a new identity. When the great city of Thebes was destroyed, its surviving citizens were left as exiles, their homes lost and their future erased. They did not simply wander, they sent a desperate plea to the Oracle of Delphi. Their question was not about wealth or victory, it was about existence itself. They asked where they should go and what they should become. The Oracle's response gave them more than a destination. It gave them a divine mandate to rebuild, transforming a scattered group of refugees into a people with a God-ordained purpose. This reveals a fifth and deeply poignant category of patron, the displaced community. For these groups, an oracle's sanction was a lifeline, a sacred tool used to forge and reinforce the social and ethnic bonds that held them together in a hostile world. A colonizing expedition setting sail from a crowded Greek city-state faced an unimaginable gamble. They were heading into the unknown to found a new settlement, a tiny outpost surrounded by unfamiliar peoples and landscapes. Before they departed, their leaders would always seek an oracle's blessing. This was not a mere formality. The prophecy they received became the foundational story of their new city, a shared narrative recited for generations. It explained why they were there, legitimized their claim to the land, and set them apart as a chosen people. The oracle's words provided a ready-made cultural identity, a powerful story that could be told and retold to unite colonists from different backgrounds into a single, cohesive community. The psychological power of this cannot be overstated. A prophecy gave a group of frightened pioneers a sense of divine destiny. It turned a risky venture into a holy mission. When they faced hardship, they could point to the oracle's promise and reaffirm their collective purpose. This shared belief was the glue that held a new society together, creating a sense of us against the world that was essential for survival. The oracle maker in these cases was not just a spiritual guide but a nation builder, providing the divine authority needed to transform a collection of individuals into a people. This intricate dance between human need and divine authority raises a final, profound question about the very nature of the system itself. A citizen seeking divine guidance faced a choice not unlike a modern consumer selecting a service. Would they travel the difficult road to the prestigious, politically connected Oracle of Delphi, or journey to the ancient, whispering oak groves of Dodona? The spiritual marketplace of the ancient world was crowded and competitive, with major oracles vying for clients' prestige and the lavish donations that came with them. Each sanctuary cultivated a distinct brand and specialty to attract its particular niche of patrons. Delphi, the most famous, was the oracle of the powerful, the choice of kings and city-states for high-stakes political and military advice. Its rituals were dramatic, its pronouncements impeccably polished, and its location central to the Greek world. In contrast, Dodona in northwestern Greece was older and more rustic, specializing in personal and practical matters. Its prophetesses, the Peleiades, interpreted the will of Zeus from the sound of the wind in the leaves of sacred oak trees and the clanging of bronze bowls. For a farmer wanting to know if his harvest would be good or a family inquiring about a missing heirloom, Dodona offered a more accessible, earthier form of divination. Further afield, the Sibyl of Cumae in Italy operated on a different model entirely. She was a lone, legendary prophetess who delivered her prophecies from a cavern, scribbling them on oak leaves that could be scattered by the wind if not collected in time. This created an aura of urgent, elusive wisdom. And then there was the supremely remote oracle of Ammon at the Siwa oasis in Egypt, a destination so isolated it attracted only the most determined and ambitious patrons, like Alexander the Great, who sought not just a prophecy but a transformation of his very identity into a living god. This fierce competition had a profound effect. It forced these institutions to innovate constantly and maintain impeccable standards. An oracle that delivered too many failed predictions would see its clientele drift to a rival. This pressure drove the development of more elaborate and convincing rituals, more sophisticated ambiguous language, and more efficient intelligence-gathering networks. The need to differentiate themselves meant that a patron could shop for the specific kind of divine experience they wanted: the political savvy of Delphi, the rustic authenticity of Dodona, or the exotic authority of Siwa. This dynamic ecosystem, where faith was tempered by market forces, ensured that the art of prophecy remained a vibrant and evolving craft for centuries. But this very success, this sprawling network of divinely sanctioned influence, would eventually attract the attention of a new kind of power, one that viewed the entire ancient system with deep suspicion. A plague could be as profitable as a war for the oracle makers. When a city was gripped by panic, its leaders did not turn to scientists or doctors for answers, they turned to the gods. The Great Plague that struck Athens in the year 430 BCE created the perfect conditions for manipulation. As funeral pyres burned day and night, a desperate delegation was sent to Delphi, begging Apollo to reveal the cause of their divine punishment and to show them a cure. The oracle's response was a masterclass in crisis management, not for Athens but for its own political allies. The priests at Delphi, with their vast intelligence network, knew exactly which rival of Athens was funding their treasury. The prophecy they issued did not mention a medical remedy. Instead, it provided a political one, instructing the Athenians to make a specific, symbolic gesture that implicitly acknowledged the authority and piety of Sparta, Athens' great enemy. This was not healing, it was geopolitical maneuvering disguised as divine instruction. In the chaotic fog of a disaster, an oracle's words became a weapon to assign blame. A famine could be explained not by poor harvests, but by the anger of a forgotten god, an anger conveniently triggered by a certain politician who had recently fallen out of favor with the oracle's patrons. The prophecy would demand that this individual be exiled or that his family make a lavish, bankrupting donation to the temple to appease the deity. The real cause of the crisis was irrelevant. The divine pronouncement created a public scapegoat, neatly removing a political opponent while enriching the sanctuary. The system was brilliantly self-reinforcing. The more desperate the people, the more absolute their faith in the oracle became. This heightened authority allowed powerful patrons, both from within the city and from rival states, to steer public opinion with breathtaking precision. A general wanting to delay a costly war could bribe the temple to issue a prophecy warning of divine wrath if the army marched before a certain date. A faction seeking to seize power could receive a divine endorsement, a statement that the gods favored their leadership to end the suffering. The oracle's voice, amplified by public fear, could drown out all rational opposition. This was the dark culmination of the oracle maker's craft. In times of stability, their ambiguous words were a shield for their institution. But in times of upheaval, those same words were sharpened into a sword, wielded by the powerful to cut through the chaos and reshape the world to their liking. The trembling voice from the tripod did not just predict the future, it actively engineered the present, directing the rage and fear of a populace toward targets of its patrons' choosing. Yet the grand theater of the oracle was never without its hecklers. A philosopher named Diogenes, living in his simple tub, once visited Delphi and was told by the priests to make a sacrifice and ask a question. He reportedly laughed, offering only a small coin and inquiring not about his own fate, but about why the famous oracle's priests lived in such lavish luxury while he, a true follower of wisdom, owned nothing. His mockery cut to the heart of the matter, challenging the very economy of divine access. He was not alone in his skepticism. The great playwright Euripides filled his tragedies with characters who were destroyed by ambiguous oracles, forcing audiences to confront a terrifying question. What if the gods' messages were not just puzzling, but actively malicious or simply false? In his play Ion, a character delivers a blistering critique, suggesting that the wise should never consult Delphi, for if the god is truly divine, he would not charge a fee for his wisdom. These were not fringe voices, they were prominent thinkers, historians, and artists who formed a powerful chorus of dissent against the prophetic monopoly. Their criticisms fell into two main categories. The first was straightforward corruption. Historians like Herodotus recorded rumors that specific prophecies had been outright purchased by wealthy patrons to smear political enemies or justify illegal power grabs. The second, more profound critique was philosophical. Thinkers asked how a perfect, unchanging God could deliver messages that were so often vague, contradictory, or dependent on human interpretation. If the future was fixed, then prophecy was pointless. If it was changeable, then the gods were not all-powerful. The oracle makers were caught in a logical trap of their own making. The very existence of this vocal, intelligent opposition is a vital piece of the puzzle. It proves that the ancient public was not a naive, homogeneous mass of believers. The priests at Delphi had to contend with brilliant minds dissecting their every pronouncement, which in turn forced them to refine their craft. Their ambiguous language was not just for political safety, but also a shield against philosophical attack. Every new, skeptical play performed in Athens or every satirical jab from a philosopher like Diogenes meant the oracle makers had to work even harder to maintain their divine aura. This constant pressure from critics kept the entire system honest in a strange way, ensuring that the machinery of prophecy could never fully rest on its laurels. It was a high-stakes intellectual arms race where the credibility of the gods was debated in the public square. A bronze bowl struck by a priest would ring out across the quiet grove of Dodona. Its sound, mingling with the rustle of wind through ancient oak leaves, was not mere noise. It was a language. The priests and priestesses there, known as the Peleiades, listened intently, interpreting the duration, the tone, and the echo of that single chime as the direct speech of Zeus. This was the tangible side of prophecy, a world where the divine will was not only spoken through a trembling woman, but also read in the world itself through a standardized toolkit of symbols, omens, and sacred objects. Beyond the famous trances of Delphi, a vast and intricate science of signs flourished, offering a more accessible and often more immediate form of divine communication. One of the most widespread methods was haruspicy, the reading of animal entrails. When a sacrificial animal was opened, a trained priest did not see a mess of organs. He saw a detailed map of the future. The liver was considered the most important organ, a mirror of the cosmos itself. Its size, shape, color, and any unusual markings or lobes were meticulously examined. A smooth, healthy liver might signify divine favor and a positive outcome, while a scarred, discolored, or misshapen one was a dire warning. This was not a random guessing game. Apprentice diviners learned from clay model livers, inscribed with specific zones that corresponded to different gods and aspects of life, from love and health to war and harvest. They practiced identifying protrusions, cysts, and the precise configuration of the lobes until they could read a sheep's liver as easily as we might read a weather forecast. Another universal language was that of the birds, known as augury. A Roman general, before committing his legions to battle, would take his place on a sacred patch of ground and mark out a section of the sky with his staff. He would then watch the species of birds that appeared, their number, the direction of their flight, and even their calls held specific meanings. An eagle flying from the left was an excellent omen, a sign of Jupiter's favor. A flock of crows scattering in panic from the right, however, could signal disaster and cause an entire campaign to be postponed. This practice required immense training and a deep knowledge of local bird life, turning the sky itself into a divine message board. For more personal or quicker questions, people turn to cleromancy, the casting of lots. This could be as simple as throwing marked pebbles, bones, or beans and interpreting the pattern in which they fell. In more formal settings, like the sanctuary at Praenest in Italy, a young boy would blindly select a carved oak lot from a sacred chest. Each lot was inscribed with a cryptic message, which a priest would then interpret in the context of the seeker's question. This system democratized divination, offering a slice of prophetic insight to those who could never afford a grand sacrifice at Delphi. What united all these methods was their reliance on a tangible, repeatable process. The tremble of a liver, the path of a bird, the fall of a lot, these were physical events that anyone could witness. The ritual of the act, the focused attention on a specific sign, created a container for meaning. It transformed the chaotic uncertainty of the world into a series of decipherable codes, giving people a sense of agency and a way to navigate their fears. While the Pythia delivered the grand narratives for kings, these everyday tools helped ordinary people decide when to plant, when to marry, and when to set sail, weaving the thread of the divine directly into the fabric of daily life. The power of the oracle did not vanish when the last sacred fire was extinguished at Delphi. As Christianity spread across the Roman Empire, a new kind of authority sought to dismantle the old prophetic networks. Emperors like Theodosius issued decrees in the late 4th century, formally closing the great pagan temples and banning their rituals. The goal was not merely to suppress a rival religion, but to silence a competing source of power. The voice of the Pythia had once rivaled that of emperors, and the new state religion could not tolerate such a potent alternative. Yet, the oracle maker's model was so deeply embedded in the human psyche that it could not be erased, only transformed. The physical sites were abandoned, their stones repurposed for churches or left to the creeping vines, but the archetype of the all-knowing seer simply found new vessels. Early Christian monks and hermits living in desert caves or on remote pillars became the new oracles, their pronouncements on faith and morality carrying a divine weight that echoed the old Pythian prophecies. The medium had changed, but the fundamental human craving for guided certainty had not. This transition from pagan shrine to Christian hermitage reveals a profound truth. The machinery of prophecy is far more durable than the gods it claims to serve. Centuries later, during the Renaissance, a different kind of rediscovery began. Scholars and artists unearthing classical texts became fascinated with the idea of the ancient oracles. They were not seen as demonic, but as a lost form of sublime wisdom. Painters depicted the Sibyls with the same reverence as biblical prophets, their faces illuminated by a divine light. The Romantic poets of the 18th and 19th centuries then took this fascination and infused it with a new emotional power. For them, the ruins of Delphi were not just historical sites, they were symbols of a lost, mystical connection to nature and the divine. A poet like Lord Byron would lament the fallen stones, seeing in them the faded glory of a world more passionate and profound than his own. This romantic revival transformed the oracle from a historical figure into a powerful cultural metaphor, a symbol of inaccessible truth and poetic inspiration. The crumbling temple became a stage for contemplating humanity's place in the universe, a function it never truly lost. This metaphorical power surged into the 20th and 21st centuries, finding a natural home in our newest myth-making machine, science fiction. The iconic oracle in The Matrix is a direct descendant of the Pythia, a figure who speaks in riddles and cookies, guiding the hero not with clear answers, but with ambiguous statements that he must interpret for himself. She operates from a humble kitchen, a modern Aditon, and her authority is based on a predictive power so absolute it resembles divinity. In Frank Herbert's Dune, the Bene Gesserit sisterhood are the ultimate oracle makers, a secretive, trained female order that uses a combination of intense psychological conditioning, political intelligence, and chemical substances to see possible futures and manipulate the course of empires. They are not passive mystics, they are active architects of human destiny, their breeding program a galactic version of the strategic marriages once sanctioned by Delphi. These modern fictions prove that the core components of the ancient system, the trained seer, the ambiguous pronouncement, the hidden political agenda, remain irresistibly compelling to us. We even see the legacy in our everyday language. When we call a brilliant economist or a visionary technologist an oracle, we are not being casual. We are invoking that ancient model of authoritative, predictive communication. The most telling modern transformation is the name itself. Oracle, the massive technology corporation, chose a moniker that directly claims the power of prophetic knowledge. Their business is data, the modern equivalent of the intelligence once gathered by temple priests. They process information on a global scale to predict trends, behaviors, and outcomes for their clients, who are the kings and merchants of our digital age. The company's very name promises its customers a god's eye view of the future, a chance to navigate the chaos of the market with divine foresight. This is not a coincidence, it is the culmination of a cultural thread stretching back millennia. The oracles are gone, but our desire for their power is stronger than ever. We still seek those who can stand at the tripod, interpret the signs of our complex world, and whisper a path through the uncertainty, proving that the most enduring prophecy of all was the oracle maker's own lasting influence on the human imagination. History often forgets the quiet footsteps of the farmer climbing a local hill, a simple clay bowl of olives and barley in his hands. His question was not of empires or trade routes, but of his daughter's future. Would the young man from the next village prove a good husband? This was the world of the sixth patron, the private citizen, whose personal hopes and fears fueled a vast, decentralized economy of local divination. For every king consulting the Pythia, there were thousands of ordinary people seeking answers from a sprawling network of local soothsayers, dream interpreters, and traveling seers. These figures were the neighborhood prophets operating without grand temples or golden treasuries, yet they provided an essential service. They addressed the universal anxieties of daily life, love, health, family, and the success of the harvest. A mother might visit a local wise woman to interpret her son's feverish dreams. A potter, before firing his most important kiln, would cast a handful of marked pebbles to see if the gods favored his work. These consultations were the affordable alternative to the great oracles, paid for not in gold, but in food, handmade goods, or small coins. This created a massive grassroots network, supporting countless lesser-known oracle makers who lived and worked within their communities. Their methods were often simpler and more direct. A traveling seer might set up a temporary booth in the marketplace, offering to read the future in the patterns of oil swirled in a dish of water. A local priest at a small rural shrine would interpret the chirping of crickets or the behavior of a sacred chicken. In countless households, the father of the family performed his own domestic rituals, observing the flight of a bird from his doorstep or the crackle of the hearth fire to guide the day's decisions. This was divination stripped of its political grandeur, reduced to its most human core. The desire for a glimpse of tomorrow was not a luxury for the elite, but a fundamental impulse for everyone. It transformed every village crossroads and every humble home into a potential portal to the divine, proving that the need for guidance, for a thread of certainty in the chaos of existence, was a patronage that knew no social class. The empire of signs began to crumble not with a bang, but with a decree. A single edict from the Roman Emperor Theodosius in the late 4th century could shutter a temple that had operated for 1,000 years, its authority now deemed not just obsolete but illegal. This was not a sudden catastrophe, but the final symptom of a slow decline that had been eroding the foundations of the prophetic world for generations. The first and most profound pressure came from the very top, from the changing nature of power itself. The rise of the Roman Empire created a new, centralized political reality. Where once a patchwork of competing city-states kept the oracles indispensable as neutral arbiters and intelligence hubs, a single, all-powerful emperor in Rome had little need for their political ambiguity. His word was law, his will the only divine mandate that mattered. The old patrons, the kings and city-states were gone, absorbed into a monolithic structure that had its own state-sponsored priests and its own imperial cult. The intricate dance between rival powers that had fueled the oracle's influence was over, replaced by the silence of a single, overwhelming voice. This political shift was amplified by a powerful intellectual current, the rising tide of philosophical skepticism that had been chipping away at the oracle's credibility for centuries. Rationalist schools of thought asked why a perfect God would speak in riddles, and why divine favor seemed so often to align with the heaviest purse. When the traditional patrons, the kings and merchants, began to listen to these critics, their faith, and more importantly their funding, began to waver. The final, decisive blow was the cultural revolution of Christianity. This new faith did not see the old gods as false, but as dangerous demons. The trembling of the Pythia was not a divine trance, but a diabolical possession. Her ambiguous words were not wisdom, but deceit from the pit of hell. This fundamental reframing turned patrons into persecutors. The wealthy families who once competed to build treasuries at Delphi now directed their fortunes toward the construction of churches. The state delegations that once sought military advice now sought blessing from Christian bishops. The entire economic and social ecosystem that supported the oracle makers withered away. The prophetic stream dried up because its sources, the royal, merchant, and communal patrons, had all been redirected. The alliance between the seeker and the seer, the patron and the prophet, was broken. The tripod stood empty, not because the gods had left, but because the people who gave their voices power had turned away, leaving the ancient oracle makers to a silence from which they would never return. A broken piece of pottery, unearthed from the dust of Delphi, can speak louder than 1,000 ancient rumors. The story of the oracle makers is not confined to scrolls and poems. It is written in the very stones and soil of their sacred sites. Modern archaeology has become our most reliable time machine, transforming speculative legends into a tangible, physical history. At the Temple of Apollo, excavators did not just find grand foundations, they uncovered the actual inscriptions, carved directly into the temple's walls and on stone slabs that recorded the prophecies given to famous kings like Croesus. These are not later copies or romantic retellings. They are the original administrative records of the oracle's operation, the official receipts of divine communication. Nearby, the excavation of the treasuries revealed their function as secure vaults. Within their foundations, archaeologists found countless small offerings, bronze and silver statues, and intricately carved gems, each one a physical token of a patron's plea or a king's gratitude. These objects are a census of devotion, naming specific cities, merchant families, and rulers who paid for access to the gods. A simple clay jar stamped with the seal of a Corinthian potter, found amidst the gold, tells us that the oracle's clientele stretched from the mightiest pharaoh to the most humble artisan, all leaving a permanent, physical record of their faith. Perhaps the most compelling evidence comes not from what humans left behind, but from the earth itself. For centuries, scholars debated the historical accounts of the strange, sweet-smelling vapors that rose from the chasm in the Aditon. Was it just a myth, a piece of poetic fiction? Geologists drilling into the bedrock beneath the temple found the answer. They identified two fault lines intersecting directly under the ruins, a geological perfect storm. Analysis of the rock and trapped spring water revealed the presence of ethylene, a sweet-smelling hydrocarbon gas known to induce trance-like states, mild euphoria, and physical tremors. The science directly corroborated the ancient descriptions of the Pythia's behavior. Her trembling was not a theatrical performance, but a predictable, physiological reaction to the very air she breathed. The sacred Castalian spring where she bathed has also been excavated, its stone basins and water channels mapping the precise ritual pathway she walked. This fusion of inscription, artifact, and geological data builds an undeniable case. We are not just reading about the oracle makers, we are walking their sacred way, touching the stones they touched, and understanding the natural forces they harnessed. The evidence confirms a world where faith was built on a foundation of real, measurable power, both human and geological. A world where the divine and the earthly were inextricably linked in the pursuit of a glimpse into tomorrow. The woman on the tripod was not merely performing, she was undergoing a profound psychological metamorphosis. modern psychology provides a compelling lens for understanding the mind of the prophet, suggesting that the secret to their power lay in a unique and fragile intersection of personality and training. One of the most relevant concepts is dissociation, a mental process where a person's thoughts, feelings, and sense of self become disconnected. This was not a sign of weakness, but a necessary adaptation. The intense rituals, from fasting to inhaling vapors, were designed to trigger this very state, allowing the Pythia to fragment her own identity and make space for the god to speak through her. Her trembling and ecstatic cries were the visible signs of a psyche deliberately stepping aside. This capacity for deep trance likely required a specific psychological profile. We can infer that successful oracle makers possessed traits like high suggestibility, allowing them to be profoundly influenced by the rituals and the expectations of the priests. They also needed immense empathy, an ability to intuitively grasp the unspoken fears and desires of the powerful patrons who stood before them. Perhaps most crucial was a talent for deep absorption, the ability to become so fully immersed in a role or a sensory experience that the outside world faded away. A person with this trait could lose themselves completely in the rhythm of a chant, the smell of smoke, and the weight of 1,000 hopes, making the transition into a prophetic state not just possible but seamless. Yet this same psychological makeup made them extraordinarily vulnerable. The constant oscillation between their own identity and the divine persona, the relentless pressure to deliver under the gaze of kings, and the social isolation demanded by their role created a perfect storm of chronic stress. We have hints in historical records of oracles who fell ill, who resisted their calling, or who seemed broken by the burden. This was the human cost of the trance, a sustained psychological performance that would have left deep, invisible scars. Viewing the oracle through this lens does not diminish their sacred role. Instead, it deepens our respect for the immense inner strength and psychological fortitude required to be the voice of the gods. They were not passive vessels, but active participants in a dangerous psychic dance, their minds the final and most complex instrument in the entire prophetic machine. Plato himself might have stood in the line at Delphi, but his question was unlike any king's. He did not seek a throne or a victory, he sought a truth about truth itself. Philosophers formed the seventh and perhaps most unexpected category of patron. Their patronage was not paid in gold or military protection, but in intellectual currency. They journeyed to the great oracles not for practical guidance, but to interrogate the very mechanics of the divine. For a thinker like Plato, the Pythia was not a simple fortune teller. She was a living paradox, a human being who claimed direct access to a perfect, timeless knowledge. How could a flawed, physical person channel the flawless realm of the forms? Her existence posed a profound philosophical problem that demanded investigation. The Stoics, who believed the universe was governed by an unbreakable chain of cause and effect, saw in the oracles a powerful validation of their core belief in fate. If the future could be foretold, then it must already be written. A prophecy was not a suggestion, it was a preview of the inevitable, a glimpse into the logical, divine order of the cosmos. For them, the oracle was a scientific instrument for observing fate in action. The Pythagoreans, with their mystical belief in the transmigration of souls, approached oracles with a different set of questions. They pondered whether the prophet's ability stemmed from a soul that had cycled through many lifetimes, accumulating a deep, ancestral wisdom that could pierce the veil of time. These philosophical schools used the oracle as a living case study, a real-world phenomenon to test their most abstract theories about the human soul, the nature of the divine, and the boundaries of human consciousness. This intellectual patronage added a crucial layer of legitimacy to the oracle's function. When the greatest minds of the age took the prophecies seriously enough to build complex philosophical systems around them, it elevated the entire institution above mere superstition. The relationship was a two-way street. The philosophers gained a tangible subject for their metaphysical inquiries, while the oracles gained the prestige of being seen as a source of deep, cosmic wisdom, not just political or practical advice. The trembling voice from the tripod now had to answer not only to kings and generals, but to the most rigorous intellects of the ancient world, a scrutiny that would ultimately force the entire system to confront its own philosophical limits. The echoes of Delphi's tripod were not the only divine whispers on the ancient wind. Far to the east, in the Bronze Age courts of China's Shang dynasty, a different kind of oracle maker was at work. A king's diviner would take the shoulder bone of an ox or the shell of a turtle, inscribe it with a question for the royal ancestors, and apply a hot bronze poker until the bone cracked with a sharp report. The pattern of those fractures, read by a trained specialist, held the answer to matters of war, harvest, and royal health. This was not a lone woman in a trance, but a state-sanctioned ritual where the very cracks in the bone were the voice of the gods. Across the world, from the misty oak groves of Celtic Europe to the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, we find the same fundamental dynamic: a powerful patron and a professionally trained interpreter of the divine. The human drive to know the future was a universal constant, but the institutional machinery built to satisfy it took strikingly different forms. In ancient Egypt, the god Ammon did not speak through a trembling priestess, but through the literal movement of a divine statue. During a grand festival, priests would carry the heavy cult statue of the god on a ceremonial bark. The direction in which they swayed or leaned in response to questions, a movement they alone could feel and interpret, delivered the god's will on state policy and military campaigns. This was prophecy as physical theater, a sacred performance entirely controlled by a priestly class who served as the sole translators for the pharaoh, their ultimate patron. Similarly, in Mesoamerica, the Maya practiced a form of divination tied to the sacred calendar. A specialized priest, the Chilum, would enter a trance state to deliver prophecies linked to the cycles of time, guiding the decisions of kings and shaping the rituals of the entire community. What unites these disparate traditions is the professionalization of the prophetic role. Whether it was a druid reading the future in the death throes of a sacrificed prisoner, or a Mesopotamian Baru priest examining the precise configuration of a sheep's liver, these were not random acts of superstition. They were highly regulated, repeatable processes administered by a trained elite. The existence of this global archetype reveals something profound about our species. Faced with the terrifying uncertainty of existence, from drought and plague to invasion and death, human societies independently arrived at the same solution. They created a specialized class of individuals, the oracle makers, who could translate the chaos of the world into a language of order and meaning. They built institutions to house them, developed complex rituals to legitimize them, and funneled vast resources to support them. The patron, whether a Shang king, a Celtic chieftain, or a Mesopotamian emperor, provided the wealth and authority. The prophet provided the certainty, or at least its convincing illusion. This was not a Greek invention, but a human one, a recurring chapter in the story of civilization where the thirst for tomorrow forged an unbreakable alliance between power and the profound. The trembling voice of the Pythia has fallen silent, and the sacred oak of Dodona whispers no more. Our journey through the secret lives of the oracle makers reveals a world far removed from the myth of the lone mystic. These prophets were the central nodes in a vast, sophisticated network. their power inseparable from the kings, merchants, generals, and common people who funded their sanctuaries and hung on their every word. They were not passive channels, but active, trained professionals navigating a high-stakes world of geopolitics and human desire. Their true genius lay in building an entire industry around the most valuable commodity in an uncertain world, the illusion of certainty. This legacy forces a profound question upon us, one that echoes far beyond the ruins of ancient temples. Whenever we encounter a voice of unquestionable authority, whether in politics, finance, or even technology, we must pause and ask who stands to benefit from this message. The oracle makers teach us that power rarely speaks with its own voice, often preferring to whisper through a carefully constructed intermediary. The tripods and trances are gone, but the human yearning they exploited, the intricate dance between those who seek guidance and those who profit by providing it, remains utterly unchanged. If this exploration into the shadows of history has intrigued you, we would love to hear which patron-oracle relationship you found most fascinating. Was it the king buying a divine mandate for war, or the merchant seeking a blessing for his commercial empire? Share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more journeys into the world's greatest historical mysteries.